Good after Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson. I'm from Design Learning. I'm so thrilled to be here today with Jeff Evans for a conversation about decision making, getting your client to take action. So as you're coming into the call, if you're joining us on Facebook, welcome, or if you're on our Zoom web stream, we want to invite you at this point to find the chat. We love to engage with you throughout the event, and we have Kelly here as our chat host today. So what I would ask you to do is in the Zoom webinar chat, use the drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees. That will ensure that everyone who's on the call can see your questions and comments. And as you're coming in, I hope you'll take a moment to let us know where you're calling in from. If you happen to be joining today with an organization, maybe a group of colleagues who are all learning together, why don't you go ahead and tell us that? And we would love to give you a shout out. Welcome to you, Gary in Orange, California, and Charlie in Connecticut. Glad to have you. Welcome in Chicago, in Houston. A few notes as we get started today. We are recording today's event, and we will be sharing the recording with you after today's event via email with some other follow-up materials. So you can feel free to listen well, and you will get also a slide deck of today's slides as follow-up from today's webinar. So welcome to all of those who are joining us from around the world. It looks like I have a friend in Ann Arbor, Michigan. That's where my heart is. Maggie, welcome to you. Welcome in India, in Kansas. It looks like we have a caller in Ireland. So a great group and a great topic. Again, for those who may have just joined, we will be recording today's session, and we are also broadcasting live on Facebook. So welcome, Jeff.
Hey, how are you? Good to see
Good.
everybody.
Yeah, how are you doing today, Jeff?
Oh, doing great. Thrilled to be on with so many great folks and partnering with you again, Becky. It's good to be on together.
Sure. So for those of you who might not know, Jeff is a vice president here at Design Learning. He has been training clients around the world for more than 25 years. So he has deep knowledge and expertise as it relates to flawless consulting. And Jeff, I do see that folks are having a little bit of trouble hearing you. So I'm just going to ask for you to be aware of that as we dive into today's content. Throughout today's event, we will invite you to put any comments or questions in the chat, engage with others. Please select all panelists and attendees as you make your comments so that everyone can see them. And we will, toward the end of the hour, take some of your questions and comments. So please feel free to put those in the chat throughout today's broadcast, and then we will get to your questions later. So as you can see from our first slide, today's topic is decision making, getting your client to take action. And Jeff, I'm wondering if you could help us by talking a little bit about the mindset that we bring to this topic.
Yeah, absolutely, Becky. So I think this is one of the core reasons we even do our work is we definitely want to have our clients make some decisions and take action. It is all about, we are in an action-oriented world. Our clients want action, we want results, and we want to be useful in helping them make those. And sometimes as consultants, again, those of us who are influencing others, we really want to help them make a decision, but we want to make sure it's the right decision. And I think the other key frustration for me at times is sometimes it feels like that the decision is for me to take the action, and the client does not necessarily fully own or fully take responsibility, accountability, if you will, for the actions to be taken. So this really is a topic that I think is good to really explore. There's nuances with that. And one of the questions maybe I kind of ask the folks that are on today to kind of think about is, when I make the statement, I want my client to take action, what action is it that we really in our heart want them to take? Is it any action? Is it action based on my recommendation? And the other question I would say is, if they say no, is that an action? Because if they have made a decision that says, at this point in time, I'm not ready to move forward, it might be frustrating, yet is that still, from a complete collaborative mindset, am I giving them the freedom to make that choice? So there's a lot of nuances, I know, from a mindset perspective when in my mind, when I say, I really wish they'd take some action. Sometimes I have to ask myself, be careful what I asked for, because of the action they take may not be aligned with what I want them to do. Am I okay with that? And how do I continue to influence them so hopefully they can make decisions and take actions that will truly help them move forward and get the results that they're looking for. So for me, it's as much of a mindset of ours coming in as it is what is the action that our clients are going to take.
Great. Well, and so let's pause for a moment, Jeff, before we dive in too deeply. It's possible that there may be some folks on the call who haven't had any previous exposure to Flawless Consulting. So could we take just a quick moment for those of you who might be new to Design Learning? Design Learning delivers flawless consulting training around the world. Flawless Consulting training is based on Peter Block's classic book. So Jeff, if you can just roll back a little bit for us and share with folks, and if you have never been exposed to Flawless Consulting before, could you type that in the chat to alert us so that we know to slow down and potentially define some topics a little bit more. So if you have never ever been exposed to Flawless Consulting, type the word yes in the chat. Wait, no, shoot. Now I'm confusing myself. Thank you to Mary who says no exposure. And I'm sorry for not making it more clear. No means no exposure, and it looks like there are quite a few of you who have not had exposure to Flawless Consulting. So Jeff, let's do a little bit of that, and then we can dive in to today's topics.
Sure, absolutely, and it really is. It's based on, so let me just, as you see the screen now, these are the phases, if you will, that Peter Block has defined in his classic Flawless Consulting book. And it really is, decision making is we need to kind of go back to basics in the core as well. So just as a quick review, if these are the 5 consulting phases that we are in, and again, consulting, if you're a consultant, it really is you're in a position to influence without direct control. I think that describes almost every role or relationship that I have in my world. So just there's the first 3 phases on this page. Our focus and what really we help folks take a look at. They're the preliminary phases. If you notice, there's 3 phases before the actual action stage, which is implementation. And in these preliminary phases, it really talks about when I first talk with the person I'm trying to influence, my client, business leader, boss, colleague, peer, whoever that person might be, I want to make sure I have an agreement with them on what we're going to do together, and as importantly, how we're going to work together. So once we have that initial agreement in place, then I want to move forward and kind of talk a little bit about how I'm actually going to get some more information about what's going on. So just to kind of move on a little bit, these are the actual key steps in a good contracting conversation. I'm not going to go over these in detail. That's something we have reviewed on earlier sessions. But the true piece I want to call your attention to is if I'm going to be collaborative and I really want my client to take some actions that considers my ideas, I need to be clear about what I want as the consultant and share those as much as listening to what the client wants. So that's the key skill set, if you will, in this conversation. And then we go down to an agreement down the left-hand piece that actually is going to restate the actions and how we move forward. So that's really a high-level, very quick overview. We actually spend a full 2 days in a workshop going through these elements, in addition to a key part over here, which I'm not talking about today, which is what happens when we get resistance, what happens with difficult clients. So that's a topic maybe for another day. So just kind of going back then, when I have an agreement with my client, then before I actually take some action, I want to take a look at what might be happening underneath the waterline, if you will, our familiar iceberg model that's been used in many, many change management scenarios. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this piece as well. And just the fact that our client kind of sees everything above the waterline. It's their perception. It's their truth. Part of our role is to slow the process down a little bit so we can get our clear picture about what else might be happening, something they may not be aware of, or something from our perspective that will help the client take some action. Again, this is all leading toward this piece today of actually taking the appropriate action. If you look at the iceberg picture, if we have our client taking action only on what they see, it may actually sink the ship if there's some things that might get in the way underneath that we might help discover before we make some decisions to take some action through that process. So more specifically, when we go into what we call discovery, data collection, getting our own clear picture, we want to make sure we hit 3 layers of the problem. But I'll also state here, and even in Peter's most recent edition of Flawless Consulting, he talks that it's not always a problem. Sometimes it's just a situation. It's the current thing we're trying to address. So we don't just want to be only focused on problems, but it really is the issue. And as we take a look at that, the first layer is how the client sees it, the presenting issue. A next layer that we want to make sure we get some information on through interviews, dialogue with others, looking at reports, looking at data. Any way we can collect information is to get a feel on how are others contributing to the current situation. And a caveat here is others may be other people, but it could be the environment. It could be budget cuts. It could be scheduling. It could be resource. Anything that might be contributing to the situation be where it is, we want to get some information and some data on that. The key piece, though, and this is where it really ties into our topic today about how do we get the client to take action, is that we want to make sure we have an understanding of how is the client contributing to the current situation. It's not that the client is being bad. It's not even the client is even aware of what they might be doing. But what we have found and what I have found, and most of the time, it's either the act of what they're doing and a lot of times what they're not doing that is contributing to the situation being where it is. And if we can get to that core, we call this not just the third layer, but the core layer, that will be what we can actually share back with the client, because that last piece is what the client actually can take action on, how they're contributing.
So Jeff, can we roll back and talk a little bit about when the process of getting the client to take action actually begins?
Sure, absolutely. So as we kind of going back to our phases, right, it begins with entry and contracting. One of our key premises is when we actually have one of our first conversations for agreement with our clients is as we build the trust and build the relationship, that's going to open the client up more to even some of our suggestions and maybe to some alternative solutions that they can own up to make a decision. The decision-making piece, as it's laid out here, is actually in the third phase. But if we don't lay good groundwork, if we don't really make sure we have good agreements, that we've actually taken a look at a bigger picture of what's underneath the waterline, that decision-making, it might be easy, but it could be the wrong decision. We could be making decisions based on just solving symptoms, as opposed to really understanding what might be happening. And the other piece, Becky, just as I call out the whole building trust, that's the piece where we can really be heard more as a consultant and not just be told, hey, the client says, go do this, Jeff, let me know when you're done. Although that happens sometimes, I'd rather have a joint decision in this third phase on feedback and decision-making where the client is taking action. That key piece over here that says decision to act, I want the client to take action as much and sometimes even more than myself as the consultant taking action.
So can we talk about some factors that are important in that contracting conversation? You know, I heard you say, Jeff, that trust is critically important. So when we come in to work with a client, we need to be developing that trust in the contracting phase. What else is critical in that contracting phase of the relationship that will help us get to action?
Yeah, it's a great question, Becky. And really, this is the core. This is the core of all the work that we do. I mentioned before the making sure we're clear about and we share what we want from the client as much as what they want from us. But also even back up a step. You know, how well have I communicated to the client that I understand what we call their presenting issue? At this point in time in the process, the client can come up with some pretty crazy ideas in our mind. But how do I honor that that's their position? That's their truth. And I'm not agreeing with them that that's the right potential solution or definition, but I honor the fact that is their perception. So just the step of communicating back to you as my client, Becky, that says, so this is what you're saying. These are the issues you're bringing up. These are your concerns. This is where you have energy. That is like, it's trust building, but it also begins to pull the client in to this partnership as opposed to them waiting for me to go implement something or me to make the recommendation too soon for the process. So that's really the key pieces there, Becky, that I would say in contracting that's going to at least give me a good foundation for this later point we want to get to make decisions that are actually going to impact the organization and decisions that are going to get the sustainable results for the process.
So it seems like what's critical that you're describing right now, Jeff, is that the client be clear that you understand those presenting issues, that you understand their perspective, so that everything that comes later is built on that common understanding of the issues that you're hoping to address.
Yeah, absolutely. I just kind of think of us as individuals, as human beings. We like to be heard. Some of the times I know when I get into a conflict situation from myself or others, it's a lot of times it's that I haven't taken the time to share, or I haven't taken the time to listen. We want to be heard. And if we can get over that initial piece of me as the consultant wanting to talk and to jump to solutions and to really share with you that I understand that I hear you, that can really take us a lot further for this foundation, so we can make some great decisions later on that's going to impact the organization.
Well, Jeff, we do seem to have a number of people on the call who haven't had exposure to this content before. So before we keep moving, we did have a previous webinar about this important area of stating wants, and as the consultant being willing to say what you want in that contracting conversation. Could you touch on that for just a quick moment before we move on?
Sure. And I think that's one of the key pieces. Most of the folks that come to our workshops, and most of the folks and where I am at as well, is that when I'm not getting the results I'm looking for, when I really look back at those conversations, I may not have been as clear about what I want. We come from a good place in support organizations, and as we support people, that we want to be of service. We want to be good customer service. But if we take that too far and just basically take orders of this is what you want, great, let me go implement it, without slowing down a little bit to understand, that's where we get into what we call kind of no-win consulting situations, where we a lot of times implement things that aren't as applicable or useful to the client. One of Peter's quotes is, let's not just be helpful, let's be useful in what we're doing. And as we do that, just a couple examples, Becky, of some wants that I have when I'm working with my client that's going to support decision making is, I want to take some time to get the clear picture. In our definition, we'll call it discovery. That's the second phase. But I won't say to the client, I want to go to discovery. I'll just say, I'm going to talk to some people. I'm going to get some data so I can make sure we are going to solving the right problem. So I ask for that. And I also say, once I've done that, I want to come back to you and share with you what I found, so then we can jointly come up with a decision on how we're going to take some action. You see how this is already tying into this taking action piece. And if we can set the stage ahead of time to actually contract for discovery, again, our language, and we're also going to contract to give feedback and decision making, they kind of know what's coming ahead of time, and we lay the foundation before we jump into actually doing it.
So Jeff, let's talk a little bit about discovery and what our intent is during that discovery phase.
Sure. So again, the key piece here is to get this clear, to get a clear picture. That's what pops out of discovery. So a clear picture, our own clear picture, our own independent view. And I would say some of the challenges, if you're an internal consultant, if you're an internal support person, that you're very familiar with the work and you're very familiar with the client, sometimes that can be a detriment if I get too close to the work and I collude and don't necessarily keep an objective view. So part of our process, whether an internal consultant, external consultant, is how do I maintain objectivity? Because that really is a key value that we can add to the client to see things a little bit differently. So that clear picture is a key piece that we talk about. Again, back to our wonderful iceberg, of the picture is what's under the waterline, what might be happening through the process. And in particular, begin to ask questions, get data on the 3 layers of what's going on with the situation, with our ultimate goal to get an understanding of how is the client contributing to the situation being where it is. Now, discovery, it really depends on the scope of the project. It could take a few hours if it's not a huge project. It could take days, weeks, hopefully it doesn't necessarily go into months, but getting more information to get our clear picture takes some time to make sure we do it right.
So, Jeff, why is it so important to identify the client's contribution to the process or the issue that we're addressing with our consulting?
Yeah, it's a great piece. That's probably one of the most important questions we get when we're doing work with folks. So, because a lot of times, and to be transparent, before I was using this model regularly, I would a lot of times stop after the second layer. I would understand what the clients wants. I would also then go out and see what are other people doing. I then come back to my client and say, so here's what's going on, and here's what everybody else is doing. And the client most of the time would say, I agree, and they wouldn't take any responsibility for what was going on. And the other piece is that middle layer, our clients can't control that. They may be able to influence budget, they may be able to do things, but when it really are things outside of their sphere of influence, it's frustrating. It leaves the client frustrated, even though it says, yeah, you're right, it's not me, and they don't feel they can take action. So the client's contribution directly leads then to them taking some action. Because if I, as the client, if I'm the client and I understand better that there's some things I'm doing or not doing that's contributing to a situation that I want to improve, that will motivate me much more to take a look. If I make a change, do more or do less or do something differently, that action can then directly lead to some results that I'm trying to get with my team, my organization, my goals, whatever it is, the key business results that we really are looking to achieve.
Got it. So how does understanding their contribution tend to impact clients? So when we're able to use this approach, we're able to not only identify other people's contributions, but also the client's contributions. What impact does that ultimately have?
Yeah, I think it really this is where we earn our stripes, our money, our resources, folks. This is the pivotal point of consulting, when we can actually give some feedback that's direct, to actually share with them what we see going on. But we also are compassionate, that we're not trying to beat them over the head, that they aren't bad people. It's just that there's some things that are happening that they may not be aware of. A lot of times when I give the feedback, or when I talk to the clients about what's happening, they will actually say, you know what, I kind of knew that was going on. You've kind of affirmed for me. And I like the fact that you've been able to connect that there's something now I can do about a situation that can at least move us in the right direction. It's never going to fix everything. We always, as a consultant, we're always looking for that, the silver bullet, the beautiful thing the magic dust that's going to fix everything. Any of us that have been in this business for longer than a week know that there's not there. But it does leave the client with a next step. What is the best next step they can take as we move forward? And it truly is empowering. And it really kind of moves them forward and to take some action to help them feel that they are contributing to the situation being better.
So Jeff, I'm wondering if you have any stories of this in action in any of the client organizations that we've served through Design Learning.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think some of the biggest ones, we deal a lot with HR teams. And I think a lot of times from a human resources perspective, whether human resources business partner, subject matter expert, whatever we might be, they really feel like that the clients just aren't going to take action what we want to do with it. So key example I'll give, in fact, it was a client that I was working with at one of a large manufacturing organization. And what I found with the client I was working with was used to the consultant showing up and just basically doing what they told them to do. And remember his name, Frank. I'll always remember Frank. Frank's was one of my favorite clients that I had. And as he was used to this, and as we kind of went through the process, hey, Frank, give me a little bit of time to get a different perspective. Give me a little bit of time to understand what's happening. Give some feedback to you on what could be different. As I went through that process, at first he was like, well, that's going to take too much time. How much time do you need? So we went back and forth quite a bit. But ultimately what I found, there's some things that he was doing with his team that he thought was going well, that the team was just disconnected. So I shared with Frank, this is, Frank, I know this is your intention, but what's happening in your delivery, people aren't clear about where you stand and what's actually happening. And then so we worked through a chance to have him be clearer about his requests. And to spend more time listening, less time talking, which I know I can do more of that. But it really got to be the point where what he appreciated was he had some control over it, but I was also with him and to help him into the implementation as that went forward. So up until then, the only feedback he got was his people weren't aligned, right? Hey, these people don't know what's happening. And he come back and say, I told you it was them, Jeff, go fix them, go fix them. But the shift of the conversation was, yeah, Frank, they want to help, and there are some things that you are kind of leaving out that will help them help you.
Yeah, that's a really great example, Jeff, and I bet it must have been a powerful moment when Frank realized that he was contributing to the challenges in his team.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because at one point in time, Frank kind of looks at me and he says, "Yeah, that's kind of what my wife tells me too. I mean, or this is they tell me I don't listen. So again, it's not a huge surprise, or he's gotten feedback from others, but when I can be specific with it and I'm able to tie what they're doing, it's having an impact of something that they don't want to have happen. That motivates them a little bit. That motivates them to say, maybe I ought to look at my own behavior, and then that could have an impact on something that I really want to see happen. So that connection, and we'll talk a little bit later about how we can actually create a feedback statement that connects these things about what the client's doing, the impact it has on the other folks, and more importantly, the impact on the organization and something that they care about.
So we have a question here from Mohammed, and he's wondering if there's more than one decision maker, does it change anything in our approach as consultants during discovery or agreement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of times one of the first things that we want to do, and I'll just kind of go back a little bit to our contracting conversation. One of the first things during contracting is to determine who are the decision makers. It would be very nice if there was just one decision maker. But with our matrix organizations now, there's multiple people. So part of this early on in the conversation through contracting, and again, here's the actual flow. My wants that I would ask from my client would be, who else needs to be involved? Who are the other, sometimes we use the word stakeholders. Who else is going to have a say in this decision? So understanding who those people are is kind of the first step, and knowing that's going to change. In fact, I've also found that changes as I go out and do discovery. So when I'm out talking to different people, I say, oh, wait a minute, this group has a lot more say-so than we originally thought. And at that point in time, I need to go back to my original client and say, hey, we have other people involved. How do we get them involved in the conversation? So I think part of it is, first step is to identify as well as we can early on who are the decision makers. And appropriately, if we can we get the decision makers in the same room? In the same room, having a conversation is much more powerful. And if we can't get into the same room, how do we get them aligned? How do we assure that the decision makers that are out there are on the same page, are pulling the ship, if you will, or pushing this in the same direction? And from there, it's multiple conversations. So it's a great question. I'd love it if it was just one conversation. We know what the decision is. We can move forward. But it's a continued curiosity and exploration throughout this process, and knowing that we need to go back to recontract, when we need to go back to discovery after we've done some feedback to the process. And it does make it more complex when there's more than one person in the room. And it can be very powerful if we have those key decision makers really listening to each other. And in fact, what I do sometimes with my key decision makers is I go through the second step here of contracting, and I ask each one of those to share back what they heard. Share back what you heard from this other stakeholder, because a lot of times we think we hear, but in my mind, we aren't necessarily explicit about that. So again, we can use these elements of this model as we're facilitating conversations with others, in addition to the one-on-one conversations that we have when we're coming up with our own agreements.
Well, it seems like it would be really helpful to hear the client wants from each of those different stakeholders that might be represented in the room, because there may be some differences in those wants, and being able to get those differences out in the open from the very start can ensure that we can move in the direction that they're requesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also throw a caution out there as well too. I would not have my first meeting with everybody in the room together. I would want to make sure, if there is a key sponsor or the key person that's bringing me in, I want to have a conversation with them about what happens if we have different decision makers in the room disagree. How do you want us to actually move forward with this? How can I support you and either potentially have the client sponsor run that meeting as opposed to me. But yeah, Becky, once we get them in the room, we do want to hear what we want from each other. And a lot of times that's probably the cause of most of our conflict, is that we don't necessarily agree with what we want. But how do we work through that and still listen to others before we jump into an implementation which may not work, or an implementation that might impact another organization that we don't, the unintended consequences of an implementation that we have. So a lot of pieces of the puzzle, if you will, that come to play, and they're great questions to continue to ask through here.
So here's a question from Kristen that applies to what we're talking about now. And Kristen, I'm not quite sure I understand your question, so I might need you to clarify it again for me in the chat. But Kristen is saying, so if you haven't gone through this contracting conversation yet, would you add in the discovery time you spent talking to others back into the contract after? So I think that maybe, Kristen, you're taking it literally that we're talking about a written contract. So Jeff, how often when we're serving as an internal consultant in our organizations, is there actually a written agreement about this process?
Yeah, that's a good point. So when we say contracting, it really is the social contract. Now, there are pieces of this that we can put in writing to make sure we have clarity, but this really is the social contract between two individuals on not just what we're going to do, but as importantly, how we're going to work together. In fact, I've done a lot of work in project management in the past. There's lots of templates out there. I think many of you probably have intake forms and things that we use to begin to gather these initial expectations. My experiences with a lot of those processes and forms is they handle a lot of what we call the technical issues of project management and technical things, but not necessarily how are we going to handle conflict. When the scope goes beyond what we have, how are we going to come back and come up with another agreement? How do we want to impact each other? How are we going to support each other? All the supporting and how we're going to work together conversations. A lot of times those aren't in there. So if that was the question as far as the written versus non-written, it's writing it down afterwards to make sure we're clear is great, but it's not something the intent that somebody's going to sign at the end. The other thing I would say, maybe reading it into the question a little bit, is sometimes people say, well, I'm internal to the organization, and so before I go in and even contract with my client, I want to go out and do some discovery. I'm going to be prepared so I can go gather data. And what's interesting, another one, a quote of Peter's would be, is that if you go and do discovery without having an agreement to do it, that's called spying. That is not an authentic way to go out and gather it, to understand it. So just be careful as an internal when you're trying to be prepared that you're not going too far. I did have an example of myself when I was a little overzealous, as I was fairly new to an organization, and when a key vice president wanted me to come in and talk about their own engagement survey, I spent some time and I knew some people in his organization. So I went out and actually had some brief, informal, they weren't interviews, they were just some conversations. And when I actually met with the vice president and started sharing some of those things, he said, why are you talking to my people? What are you doing out there? So just be careful. If our intention to be prepared, it's not authentic to go out and gather this information unless we have an agreement to go do so. And it could be a very quick agreement. Hey, before I meet with you, Vice President, I want to go just have a couple of conversations. Is that okay? As opposed to more of the formal discussion, but just I've been burned a couple times on that in the past. Had another senior vice president that she gave me the same feedback to be careful when I was out there talking to her folks through the process. So it's just as a 25 years as an internal consultant, it's some of the knocks that we take with good intentions to make sure that I am coming up front and having a good agreement before I move forward too fast.
Thanks, Jeff. So getting back to our overarching promise of today's event, we promised that we want to talk about this topic of decision making, how to get your clients to take action. So Jeff, let's transition a little bit and let's talk about, once we understand the client's contribution, once we've done this discovery and we're ready to get to this place of feedback, can you give us some guidance on how can we share feedback in a way that will get our clients to take action on our recommendations?
Yeah, great. So that's kind of the next piece here. So this is the third phase, feedback and decision making. So our recommendation is when we meet back with the client, to kind of begin with where we started. Kind of going back. Sometimes if it was yesterday, they might remember. Sometimes it's been weeks that have gone by since our initial agreement that goes on. So just a kind of a restatement is where we started is you asked me to solve this problem, look at a situation, use my expertise in a certain area, and we understood what that was. And then my agreement was that I was going to go out then and understand what else might be happening that we aren't aware of. So I've actually been out, I've talked to some people, I've done surveys, I've looked at reports, whatever that data gathering process was, and basically, and this is what I found. This is what I found as far as how they see the presenting problem. Here's how other people are contributing with what's going on. Here are some of their concerns. Then ultimately getting to this core layer of, and based on my information, here's the role that you're playing. Here are some things that you are doing that are contributing to the exact situation that you want to improve upon. I then pause. And this is where I think a lot of times when we confuse feedback with recommendations. Many times when somebody comes to give me feedback, they just want to tell me what to go do. Telling somebody to go do is not feedback. That's a recommendation, or that's something that we want them to go do this. So if you can separate it and just say, here's from my data gathering, here's how I see you're contributing, and I pause. And I said, I'd like to get your reaction to what I just said. Now, a lot of times the client's not going to be super happy. They're not going to jump up and down and say, oh, thank you for bringing this to my attention. I've been waiting my whole life for you to say these things. A lot of times they might be a little bit, oh, what do you mean? And they could get defensive, but we just kind of hang in there to just say, and as they kind of we help them work through that to get to the point where they understand the feedback, and ultimately do they accept, okay, this is what you found, Jeff. I may not completely agree with everything you found, but I do accept that this is the data that you came up with. That's the piece we want to get to before we jump into recommendations. And the other step that I do after this then, because this really gets to ownership and it gets to a chance where the clients could be the committed, I probably have several things in my mind as the consultant that I want to recommend. But before I lay those on the table, what I would ask you, if you're my client, Becky, I would say, you know what, Becky? Based on this feedback, what are some of your thoughts of what you want to go do? As you think through this, what could you do more of, less of, what might be happening? A lot of times the clients will have some ideas. And that's where we get into a joint collaborative conversation that if the client says something that I think was great, I would agree with them. If they say something that I don't necessarily agree with, I would share that as well. Well, I'm afraid if you do that, Becky, it might not get what you want. Have you considered something else? So this is truly a collaborative conversation. It's not just me saying, client, go do what I tell you to go do. But I do share recommendations. I've also had clients that after I get to this reaction, they say, you know what, Jeff, I get it. And I don't know what to go do next. I've done everything I know how to do. I have the time to do. It can't wait. What ideas do you have for me? So I need to be prepared to share. Well, here's my experience. Here's what I recommend. What do you think? But again, it's not me telling them what to do. It's me sharing what I think will work and then going into a conversation to understand what would work for them in their environment, in their culture, to actually make some steps going forward. So that's the piece of talking through this next step. And what options does the client have? Their own options, some options I've thought about. We may brainstorm some things that neither one of us has thought about individually, but collectively we start coming up with some specific things that are happening. And the key piece is where we, after we've kind of gone through and come up with some ideas, we can have a lot of ideas. We really want to ask, what is the future that the client wants to create? What is it that's really going to change some things that are going on? And what do we think the client should focus on? What should they go do next that's really going to help take them to the next level? What's the best next step for them that they are committed to do and they feel is going to actually have an impact on to the current situation they were facing?
So Jeff, what I'm taking away from this is that the internal consultant has the best chance of getting the client to take action if the client, him or herself, comes up with that action. So at the point in which we deliver feedback, and at the point at which the client is owning their role in the current situation, if they are generating the ideas and the next best steps, they're more likely to take action. So I'm curious what you would do in a situation where the client isn't willing to identify their own next steps and is more looking to you as the expert to say, tell me what to do. Like, what are the chances of the client implementing those recommendations?
I think the chances are, if we actually tell them exactly what to go do, probably not very much. But if I lay it out there as an idea, have you considered trying this? In my previous experiences with similar situations, some of my other clients have had success doing this. What do you think? If I really feel strongly about a certain thing, I'll say, look, I really think this one thing is going to work, and this has to work in your area. So it really comes again, we like being experts. We like being the one that said, hey, I solved that problem for the client. In reality, we're trying to help the client discover what they can do to solve their own situations. And if we can help them, coach them, and consult with them in a way that's not like, okay, I got it, go do this, go do A, B, C, and D, and you'll be fine. That recipe type of approach, I know, just doesn't work. So it really is, how do we give our recommendations as options, and we can take a stance that we really feel a certain thing is going to work, but ultimately it's choice. And one of Peter's key elements throughout this whole process is, what choices are we making as the consultant, and what choices are we giving to our clients? And one of those choices might be no. My best recommendation I lay out there, they may look at me and say, you know what, Jeff, I get it. And at this point in time, I'm not ready, or I don't feel I can. So thanks for your help. And am I okay with that as a consultant? And I think part of that is, if we've done our best job laying it out there, our client still has the right to implement and do or not do what they want as it moves forward. And sometimes it's hard for me, I know, individually, to let go of that, because then I think, well, if they would just, and sometimes I just need to back off a little bit and say, that's where they are now, and we can come back and revisit.
Sure. So I have a couple of questions coming in, and I love this question from Jeffrey. He says, after the decision is made, he assumes it's best practice to document the decision. What's the best way to document that decision, through email or some other mode?
Yes, to all. So I think, again, the question I would have for that is what's my intent for documenting? Is my intent for documenting so I can come back and say, client, you didn't do what you said you were going to do? If that's the case, I would say no. If my intent for documenting is for clarity on both of our parts, I would send an email potentially after the meeting and just say, hey, client, hey, Julie, here's my understanding of the agreement. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's my understanding of what you're going to do. Let me know if I missed something, and we're going to press forward, and we're going to meet again in a week or 2 weeks. So it's a collaborative approach to documenting, not I'm going to keep this so I can catch you not doing it. But documentation is very helpful, because as our busy worlds, I know after a conversation, sometimes we forget or we don't have clarity. So, documenting piece, but the other piece would be at the end of this conversation, you want to do some kind of mini contracting on what are we going to go do next. Here's what I want you to do. Here's what you want me to do. Yes, we agree. Here's what we are going to go do. So there's always a chance to make sure we have an agreement after we leave any meeting or conversation that we have, no matter where we are in the phases of the process.
So here's a question from Gary, going back to those early phases of the process, and it may even be helpful to go back to that first slide, Jeff. Gary is wondering if the discussion about the future the client wishes to create, if that could occur in that first contracting meeting. So what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I would say do anything that you can talk about earlier on in the process, the better. Anything that we can at least get on the table. It might not be resolved. But I would say there's a little bit of that in entry and contracting. I find it coming out more in the discovery phase. And the other piece is that you can have a discovery conversation with your client. It doesn't just have to be with others. And part of what we talk about in the workshop is that we want to make sure we do have some present focused questions. How is it going? But also some future focused questions. How could it be? If it was working, what would be happening? What is the future you want to create? So I think building those in, and we strongly recommend during your questions, not just of the client, but of other people you're talking to is also be future oriented. We want to leave the client organization with some thoughts about, hey, there are some things we can do better. What I have found, if I just stay present focused, it really can get into everything that's wrong, and we feel stuck, and it's not very empowering of an environment to create. So if we put in some of those questions and thoughts about the future that we want to create throughout the process, absolutely. Good point. And I think that could go be throughout each of these phases, present-oriented as well as future-oriented questions.
Well, and what I've heard you say on a number of occasions, Jeff, and in my own experience of attending the Flawless Consulting workshops, sometimes we have to jump back to that contracting conversation more than once as we're moving toward a solution with our clients. You know, it might be time to recontract.
Yeah, that's probably, if not, sometimes recontracting can be even more important than the initial contract. And even though we lay these phases out linearly, life never happens in a linear fashion. We do strongly recommend that you don't skip steps, so not jump from entry and contracting right to implementation. But if I'm in discovery and I'm finding some things out that may change my agreement, I want to go back. If I'm in my feedback meeting with my client says, you know what, Jeff, I think you missed a key part of the organization. You need to go back and do some more discovery. There's always a loop back mechanism that we can do, and being aware. And there's always an opportunity at each of these phases to recontract. What's the agreement we have as we leave the meeting?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we are open to some additional questions as we wrap up this hour together. So if you have some additional questions or comments, I would invite you at this point to put those in the chat. Just as a gentle reminder, everyone would love to see your questions. So please use the drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can read them. And, you know, we would love to hear from you. Jeff, I'm wondering if you have any stories while we're looking for additional questions about, you know, a time when you've been super successful in getting a client to take action and what that looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. Go back to my, actually, the healthcare example. I spent my most recent internal job was with a large healthcare organization, working with physician leaders, nurse leaders, and administrative leaders. And it was actually a key physician leader who, crazy schedules of balancing, taking care of patients as well as leading an organization. And as he was so busy in doing the work that he was doing, he was just assuming that the other physician leaders and nurse leaders working with him kind of knew where he stood. And they really, and they kind of almost that they could read his mind because he was moving so quickly. So the feedback that I gave to Frank, this was Frank. This was actually John in this as a physician, actually here in the Cleveland area. John understood that slowing down was not a weakness. He had been trained so much as a physician and in a very fast pace that always had to be busy. So the basic feedback is that to put some time in his schedule and put some time in his meetings to pause and think about what might be happening before we take action, which might not work. And what was helpful for him is that he used the same process with patients, knowing that a quick diagnostic or diagnosis wasn't always the best. So he also said there are times when you're in a life-saving mode that you got to act quickly. But there are a lot of times when it isn't super urgent that we can actually pause a bit. So we actually started putting things into his meetings. He had stand-up meetings every Tuesday morning with all his key leaders. As opposed to running through an agenda and going through, here's what we got to do, here's what we got to do. He just paused and said, how are we doing? What can I do for you more today? What do you need from me? And really kind of put that element in, which created an environment for people to share. And also what he told me was it gave him some time to think about what was happening. So just the feedback on slowing down was not going backwards, which a lot of people think it is, and hitting the pause button. So pausing to think is an action, and it's an action to be thoughtful.
That's really helpful, Jeff. So I have a question from Tom, and he's wanting us to define what is an internal consultant.
Good. Yeah, it always comes up. So, let me just go back to the consulting piece, or a consultant really is anyone who has influence without direct control. And again, that describes my role as a leader, as an internal consultant. Really, for the most people that we work with at this point are the support organizations that aren't in the line of the business. So human resources, IT, project management, continuous improvement, finance, those kinds of things, even some sales and marketing. We have clients that have their sales and marketing folks in here that ultimately they are trying to influence the line organization, but don't have the complete control to make the decisions to do that as it goes. And I would also say this is just as applicable to external consultants as internal. It's just as difficult. I've been in both roles. There's different nuances, different pressures. When I'm an internal consultant, I think it's easier to be external. When I'm an external consultant, it feels like it's easier to be internal. I kind of gone back and forth. It's a tough role. And I would just say, if you don't consider yourself a formal consultant, my guess is that if you're in a position to influence without direct control, that you are in a consulting mindset or a consulting role.
And so that we can be clear, Design Learning offers flawless consulting training internal to organizations to help equip internal consultants to be more effective. And then we also have public workshops. And I imagine quite often external consultants might benefit from the training that we offer. I do have a question related to external consultants, Jeff. Mohammed is wondering, for external consultants, where in this consulting phases process does discussion of professional fees come into play?
That's probably always the first question that we as externals want to say. I would up front. I mean, I might not make an offer yet up front in the actual agreement because I don't know enough about it. I know as an external, sometimes my business model is that I will come in and talk with you and actually do some discovery without charging a fee. And then I will actually come to you with some feedback and recommendations, and that actually would talk about being paid. Other consultants will come up and say, hey, in order to get some more information, I do need a fee for that. So there's different ways to approach it. The key thing would be is in that first conversation to say, at some point in time in this process, client, I want to talk about professional fees. I don't need an answer now. And if they have a budget in mind, that can be helpful. But I think sometimes my learning is if I push too quickly to understand not just only their budget, what my offer would be, I might sell myself short. There might be more work to be done, or sometimes if there isn't some resources there, I get too far down the line. So the key piece is bring it up early. And again, it really is a topic that says I want to make sure that we set aside time throughout this process to talk about fees. Because the other thing I know as an external, a recontracting ask is as scope gets bigger and bigger, I realize I'm being asked to spend much more time than the original contract, yet my fee seems to be staying the same. That's not a good business model for me. So I just want to make sure that I open it for the client. I want to be able to talk about that and to come back and come with a mutual agreement when I feel the scope and the fees aren't aligned. And also I ask them, I want you to come back to me if you feel that for whatever reason, the scope and the agreements aren't aligned as it goes on. So definitely needs to be topic-wise brought up. Decision-making, feedback and decision-making probably is where we actually make a decision on, okay, here's what I'm going to go do, and here is the fee I'm going to charge for that. But I wouldn't wait till that phase to bring it up because it just feels like we don't always want to bring that up anyway. But again, it's the earlier at least to broach it, I have found it to be the most helpful.
Thank you, Jeff. So here is a question from, I don't want to mispronounce your name, but I think it's Hemant in India. He is wondering, Jeff, if you have any insights on a situation where you've discovered root causes, but the client only wants to deal with the surface solution, and what can you do to arrive at a good decision?
You run away as fast as possible. No, just kidding. That does come up. And I think partly would be I would check with myself, was I clear enough when I gave the feedback what was happening? And if I really said, I was clear, that's a good example of resistance. And again, resistance is not a topic that we talked about, but there's a whole piece on the bottom right-hand side of this flow of when we feel stuck. And if the client is not willing to necessarily deal with some root cause, a lot of times that shows up as behaviors where they change the subject, they cancel meetings, they just want to push everything off on me. A key behavior that I've seen in this particular case is they start blaming others. They agree, hey, yet it is all of those folks out there, as much as I try to get them to take responsibility. So there are some specific steps, and I think maybe that's a future web topic on what specifically can I do to help manage and lean into this resistance, because it's a signal that something more important is going on. I don't want to squash it. I don't want to overcome it. I want to deal with it authentically, because if I can get to that root core cause of why the client is resisting or is maybe reluctant to take responsibility, that's where our work gets done. So it's an attempt to actually move there. And in the end, even if I've done all of these steps and the client still says, you know what, Jeff, I hear what you're saying, but I think it's this other things, and that's the point of decision for me is, do I say no and walk away? Do I minimize my investment and just kind of go along? Do we escalate? There's different choices to make once we get to that actual point in the process where we do feel we are at an impasse.
Well, and I'm seeing some requests that, yes, we should have a webinar on resistance. So I'll note that as we plan for our 2020 events. Wow. We are going to take maybe one or two more questions. Please continue to type them in. We could use them as inspiration for a future blog post. And we sure appreciate all the comments and input. So this question might require a little bit of definition for those who haven't been exposed to Flawless. But Kevin says, for clients who want you in a pair of hands role, and we should probably define pair of hands role, what discussion do you have with the client to move toward collaboration?
That's a great question. So the best kind of definition of pair of hands is that we're an order taker. I show up and basically the client says, Jeff, I want you to go do that. I says, great, when do you want it? I'll have it to you by tomorrow at noon. So I am basically, the client is bringing the solution to me. They have already gone through their own diagnostic, their own solution generation. They basically are bringing, Jeff, here is a solution I want you to implement. So we become a pair of hands, if you will, taking the orders to go implement their solution. The key piece would be is that if we get a sense for that, and usually and I'll even point to the chart I have up right in front of us, we get a sense for that when we say, client, what do you want from us? And they say, well, I want you to go put this in place for me. They're going to let you know. They're not going to use the word pair of hands. I would hope they wouldn't use those words, but they're going to be the sense of they want you to implement their solution. So the key piece at this point would be, as we would say, I could do that. And what I want to do, this is me stating my wants, is I want to spend a little bit of time really understanding the issue, going a little bit deeper underneath the iceberg. So I want to make sure what we are putting in place really is going to solve and be sustainable for that solution. So I want to spend some time understanding more. And then I want to come back to you and share with you what I find. And then we can really take a look at, is that initial solution you had in place going to be the best solution? The other thing I ask for at this stage is I ask my client, I want you to be open to solutions that we haven't yet thought of. So it's not that their solution is bad, I just don't know yet. So if I can open their minds a little bit to say there might be some other alternatives, then when I come back with some of those, the conversation can be not just me doing what they want me to do for a solution, but we really get a sustainable, collective, collaborative solution that's going to have even more impact, hopefully, than the initial solution the client thought of.
That's really great, Jeff. Thanks so much. So we are just about out of time, but I want to make sure that I let you know about a few exciting things that are coming up. So we at Design Learning are celebrating this year 40 years as an organization delivering flawless consulting training around the world. And we have two very special webinars coming on October 1st and October 2nd at different times so that we can hit all the time zones around the world. And Peter Block, who's the creator of this flawless consulting approach and the author of the classic book, will be joining us for some very special Q&A and story sharing about Flawless Consulting and the impact that Flawless Consulting has had in organizations around the world since it started 40 years ago. So we would invite you to visit our website at designlearning.com to find out more about those upcoming webinar events. We do also have one more content-based webinar in November with Lydia Schimmelfinnig, who's another of our vice presidents. And I also want to make sure, Jeff, we're looking at your screen. If you are interested in bringing Flawless Consulting to your organization, your best next step would be to call or email Pat Smith, who's our CEO. He's psmith@designlearning.com, and Pat or others on our team can certainly talk to you about bringing Flawless Consulting training internal to your organization or about some of our public offerings. We actually are in Red Bank, New Jersey next week to a sold-out set of workshops, Flawless 1 and Flawless 2, taking folks through all the content on Flawless Consulting. We do have workshops next year in London, in Silicon Valley, and again in Red Bank, New Jersey. So if you're interested in finding out about any of those, we have lots of information on our website at designlearning.com, and we would invite you also to check out those October special anniversary celebration webinars with Peter Block. So Jeff, thanks so much for today's conversation. Thanks to all of you who have invested time with us. And I do see a question, what's the plan for India? There are plans for India. Stay tuned to hear more. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.